Kirby series, Mario knows the new and improved Mario and Super Mario All-Stars. So much Mario, it's a Mario smorgasbord. It's all the way down Mario Brothers adventures you ever played and then some. But this is juiced up 16-bit only on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System on Super Mario All-Stars. 4 complete Mario games, including the never-seen lost level, so you can't get more Mario than this, which is why the best played here.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Super Nintendo review here on Player One Start. You know, if it's anything I think of when I think of a game for the Super Nintendo, it has to be the platforming action-adventure genre. This type of game was so popular at the time that many people would just call these types of games video games. Though Nintendo wasn't the first company to come up with the idea of a platform game, they were the ones that made it mainstream and the one that everyone wanted to get their hands on with the game Super Mario Bros. 6 short years later in 1991 when the Super Nintendo released, the most anticipated game for the system would be an action platform game, Super Mario World. That game itself has been called a masterpiece and one of the best video games ever made. So what chance did anybody else, including Nintendo themselves, have at topping the very first game for the system? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the platform games for the Super Nintendo. This video is only going to focus on the games produced by Nintendo, Konami, and Capcom, 3 video game publishers that I associate very heavily with the Super Nintendo. Let's go ahead and take a look. Since I've already covered Super Mario World as a launch title, I thought it'd be prudent to go back and take a look at Super Mario All-Stars, which was one of the few games that we owned for this system when I was growing up with the Super Nintendo. I'll also throw into perspective that this is the first time I ever played Super Mario Bros. 2. We owned the first Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario Bros. 3, but my brothers, I guess, didn't like the Super Mario Bros. 2 version that we got, so they never ended up buying it or asking my parents for it. This would also be the first time that I would play the real Super Mario Bros. 2, shown as lost levels in this collection. And I have to tell you, for a remaster of all these games, they were very well done. It is almost insane with the amount of detail that the development team put into making sure that this was a faithful recreation of the original, while adding something new for the Super Nintendo crowd. I definitely recommend this game collection as being some of the best on the platform, and if you can find it, you can even find the Super Mario All-Stars and Super Mario World game cartridge, which has 5 games in one, including, in my opinion, the best platformers on the system. Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island is kind of a black sheep in the Mario franchise in my opinion, as I really feel like they only included the Super Mario World branding on it to sell more titles. I definitely wouldn't have had much of an interest in it, at least in 1995, if I just saw the Yoshi's Island and Baby Mario aesthetic that they had in here. However, when I came back to this title to play it as an adult, I had a much better appreciation for what they were going for with this game. It's actually very well designed and well done, which shouldn't be any surprise knowing that this is one of Nintendo's first-party titles. The hand-drawn aesthetic was not really well received, at least by me and my friends back in the day, but looking back on it now and playing back through it, I really think the art style helps this game hold up a bit better than some of the other games in the later part of the Super Nintendo's life. Again, in this short review, I can't really give it justice except for to say I'd give this game about a 9 out of 10, and if you were like me and didn't really give this game a chance back in the 90s, you may enjoy it more today. I am a longtime fan of the Kirby series, starting out with his adventures on the Game Boy, eventually making my way through the Super Nintendo titles as well. In Kirby Superstar, similar to other entries in the Kirby series, you can control Kirby to complete various levels while avoiding enemies and obstacles. You can walk, run, jump, swim, crouch, slide, and inhale enemies or objects and spit them out as bullets. Kirby can also fly for a limited time by inflating himself, and while flying, Kirby cannot attack or use his other abilities, though he can release a weak puff of air as he drops. By devouring certain enemies, Kirby can copy their abilities, which, I mean, let's face it, if you played a Kirby game, you know how this goes. As the game artwork describes, this is actually a collection of around 8 different games. The game is split up into 7 smaller games, along with 2 different mini-games. One of my favorites out of this has to be Spring Breeze, which is an abridged remake of the first Kirby game, Kirby's Dream Land. Gourmet Race is a racing game in which Kirby races King Dedede, and probably has the most iconic of all the Kirby themes in there. There are other classic games in here as well, and I'm not going to cover each one of them in detail, but I really recommend this game as one of the essentials for your Super Nintendo, especially if you're a fan of the Kirby franchise. I'd give this around an 8 or a 9 out of 10. Kirby's Dream Land 3 was one of the later titles released for the Super Nintendo. It is the 5th primary Kirby game overall, and although it's the 3rd game in the Dreamland series, it is the first to be released on a home console and not a handheld. I mean, as long as you don't count the Kirby Superstar remake of Dreamland 1. Again, this is another Kirby game that I think knocks it right out of the park. If you like any of the 2D side-scrolling Kirby games, this one has got to be a game that you have to play. As I said, this game was the last game released in North America for the Super Nintendo, and one of the last games released overall for the system. They really knew what they were doing but with the hardware by then, creating a game that not only looks excellent, but I think plays very well. And again, I'd recommend to almost anyone, especially as an entry to the series, and I'd give it around a 9 or a 10 out of 10. Oh, and for some of the naysayers who say that these games are too easy, that's kind of the point of Kirby, isn't it? Just to have fun with it? It's more of a casual game than a challenging game. Super Metroid is an iconic title that I really don't feel like needs a review or an introduction. If you haven't played this game by now, you definitely need to try it out. This game is not one of the original that I owned in my collection back in the day, but it is one of the first titles I bought when I started collecting Super Nintendo games back in the mid-2000s. The eerie aesthetic, the creepy art style, the futuristic sci-fi theme, everything about this game just creates an immersive experience that I think holds up very well today, not just in its style and presentation, but in the gameplay. I realize this game might not be for everybody, but I would give it a 10 out of 10 as a definite recommend for your collection, and give it a try if you haven't already. I suspect that one day on this channel there will be an entire video dedicated to Donkey Kong Country and its sequels. The impact of this game, not only on the Super Nintendo, but the gaming industry as a whole and the 16-bit war, cannot be understated. And even though I could go on for hours about this game in this short little blurb as we have more games to get through, I'm just going to say that Donkey Kong Country is one of the best platformers on this system. The mind-blowing graphics, the great musical score, the tight platforming controls, just everything is exactly what you want out of a side-scrolling platform game. And for those of you that may have heard, there was this kind of misquote going around from Shigeru Miyamoto saying that he didn't really feel like Donkey Kong Country was a real game, or that he didn't really like the game, but that is actually not the case. And I think those comments that people have picked up on have been blown grossly out of proportion. But more importantly, what I think of the game is that it is definitely one that I didn't own back in the day, but spent more renting this game than it would have cost to actually buy the game. And as much as I like the first game, you can double that for the second game. Donkey Kong Country 2 is one of my favorite video games of all time. The pirate theme, again the graphics, art style, music, tight platforming controls, and the alternating gameplay that you get between Diddy and Dixie Kong just hits a sweet spot for me personally that, to this day, I still come back to play because I find it fun, although some of the levels are just insanely ridiculous in terms of frustrating difficulty. Donkey Kong Country 3 is a game I think gets overlooked way too much by the gaming public as, oh, it's just not as good as the first two. And while I do agree it's not as good as Donkey Kong Country 2, I would put it on par with Donkey Kong Country 1. It's still a good game, and it really expands upon what you saw in Donkey Kong Country 2. Yeah, it's a bit more generic and the musical score isn't as well done as in the other two games, but it's something that I rented back in the day, I had no problem with, and still to this day, I am perplexed at why people think this is the black sheep of the franchise. Overall, I give this series a rare 9.5 to 10 out of 10. Disney's Aladdin is one of those games that I constantly rented back in the day, but again, never purchased because of the cost of a cartridge being so high. It helps for me that Aladdin is one of my favorite Disney movies, especially during that time period, and I think it still lives up to this day. But also, just hearing the words Capcom Disney platform game should mean good game in itself, because Capcom set the bar high for licensed video game platformer, from the late 80s to the early 90s. This game is different from the version that came out on the Sega Genesis due to having different game developers, so I think that really does make this game a bit more essential if you were going to own platformers on the Super Nintendo. I give this game about a 9 out of 10. The Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse was a constant weekend rental for me back in the day, and again, seeing that Capcom logo on a Disney license should let you know that this game would be very well done. In this game, you play as Mickey Mouse, and you have to traverse different levels searching for Pluto, while using different abilities unique to each stage in order to defeat enemies. Fantastic game, very nostalgic for me. I'd give it around an 8 or a 9 out of 10, and definitely recommend, if you haven't played this before, to pick it up and give it a try. This game also spawned 2 sequels, one of which was exclusive to Japan, but the Gray Circus Mystery also came out for the Super Nintendo here in the United States. And although personally I'm not as big a fan of this game, it's still a solid follow-up to the original, and if you have a Game Boy Advance or a Super Famicom, you can get the third game as well. Goof Troop is an action-adventure video game for the Super Nintendo that was developed and released by Capcom, hitting North American shelves in July of 1993. It is based off the animated TV series Goof Troop, which I have to admit I spent a fair amount of time watching back in the day. But to my surprise, I was actually unaware of this game's existence for many years. In this game, you play as Goofy or Max as you work through 5 areas on Spoonerville Island, with the goal being to rescue Pete and PJ, which are being held captive. In each level, you have to solve various puzzles in order to reach the end and defeat the stage boss. In order to get through each level, players must collect various items to use to solve the puzzles. Some items will also be used in defeating enemies and used in the boss battles, as Goofy and Max do not fight them directly. The whole game is played from this top-down perspective, which gives me a little bit of vibe from The Legend of Zelda, but it doesn't quite play the same. And one thing I really like about this game is you can play it with 2 players at the same time, cooperatively. Out of the 2 playing modes, I did find this game to be a lot more fun with a second player, as I think that adds a bit to the gameplay, as the single-player campaign is really lacking in a lot of challenge, and just seems monotonous to go through by yourself. Overall, I'd give this game about an 8 out of 10, which is in line with reviews when it first came out, as well as retro reviews today. And if you have a Super Nintendo, this would be one to get, especially if you have younger kids you want to play games with on the system. Bonkers is another Disney animated television show that was licensed to Capcom to make a video game out of. In this game, you play as Police Officer Bonkers D. Bobcat as you go through 6 different levels to apprehend a thief who has stolen items from a cartoon museum. You have the ability to toss bombs at enemies, jump on their heads, or perform a speed dash, which is used to break through some obstacles. Once you've made your way through each level, a boss awaits you at the end. Defeating the boss means moving on to the next level. Out of all the Capcom platforming games released for the system, I would say this one is the weakest, but the game is very well made, as I would expect from a Capcom platformer of this era, and it shouldn't provide too much of a challenge for a more experienced player, but it could be good for kids. Again, I give this around a 7 out of 10. Demon's Crest is a spin-off from the Ghosts and Goblins series, being developed and published by series creator Capcom. As implied by the title, the game's story revolves around 6 magical crests, each of which have power over a certain element. The gameplay is a mix of platforming along with some mild RPG elements. The stages are divided into different main areas which can be played multiple times, often requiring you to visit a level again with a newly acquired crest to access things that could not be accessed before. This is not a game I played much back in the day, but it's actually a game I played when I got my Nintendo Switch Online subscription, and I quickly got hooked on this game. It can get a little bit repetitive, but I really feel like the game's graphics and sound hold up well thanks to their excellent design. And I would give this yet another 9 out of 10, being one of the better platformers on this system that I like coming back to. Keep in mind though, I didn't grow up with this title, so this is a contemporary review only. Castlevania Dracula X is actually a remake of Castlevania Rondo of Blood, which was an exclusive to the PC Engine Super CD-ROM 2 in Japan. While the plot is very similar to Rondo of Blood and it uses many of that game's graphics, it features all new levels and altered gameplay elements instead of being a straight port. It came out in September of 1995 in the US, and has since been re-released on other modern platforms. Upon its release, this game received mixed reviews, with a lot of critics stating that it was an inferior conversion of the PC Engine game of which it's originally based off of. Looking at game reviews out of the time, they're giving it around a 6 or a 7 out of 10. But in my opinion, this deserves more of an 8 or a 9 out of 10. If you look at this game as a standalone title and not one based on the technically superior PC Engine version, I think this game stands well on its own. Definitely a good time if you're a fan of the Castlevania series, or if you've just picked one up for the first time. Maybe there's a better one to start with, but I think this one holds a special place in my collection. The Legend of the Mystical Ninja hit the Super Nintendo in February of 1992. Some of you who are fans of this series may know that this is the first game in the Japanese video game series Ganbare Goemon to have a Western release. Also, fans of this series may know how I'm mispronouncing this name, and you can let me know in the comments below the proper pronunciation. But in the meantime, let's continue on with the gameplay, where you can control one of two players. And although both characters have different weapons and learn different attacks, functionally they are identical, so it doesn't really matter which one you pick, at least in my experience. You start out with a short-range weapon which can be upgraded as you play through the game, and you also have some throwing weapons available from the beginning as well. However, each time you use one, it will decrease the amount of money you have. Each character can also learn some judo abilities, which again can be upgraded as you play through the game. Each stage in the game is divided into two separate sections, with the first one centered on a town for exploration, where the players can gather information, buy items, learn special judo attacks, play minigames, earn money, and so on. The second section of the game is a platforming section, where the players fight through minor enemies until they reach the end to defeat a boss. This game has received critical and fan acclaim since it released in 1992 here in the US, but this franchise has been much more successful in Japan, leading to many people skipping over this game, including myself. Being introduced to this game many years later was a pleasant surprise to me, as I did end up enjoying this game and found myself wanting to grind through it a lot more. But if you're going for a physical copy for your collection, it may cost you, because this game is a bit more rare, or at least more desirable, and hence the pricing on it is a bit higher than your typical Super Nintendo game. Sparkster is another side-scrolling platform game that was developed and published by Konami, releasing in North America on October of 1994. And although this is the sequel to Rocket Knight Adventures on the Sega Genesis, this is the only game in the series to be released on the Super Nintendo. In this game, you play as the main character, the opossum knight named Sparkster, who fights an army of yellow wolves and robots. He's armed with a sword that can fire energy bolts, and a rocket pack that allows him to fly for short distances. If you played the previous entry in this series on the Sega Genesis, the gameplay here has remained largely untouched. Although one of the most notable changes to the gameplay was the addition of a short-distance rolling dash. At the end of each level, Sparkster will battle a boss, and when he is defeated, the level is done. I will forewarn you, if you start out the game on easy, you won't get to play through the entire game. That's also true on normal difficulty, although it goes a bit further than the easy difficulty. The only way to truly see the entire game is to play it on hard. This game was rated mostly positively when it was first released, giving around a 7 or 8 out of 10, and that's about where I would rank it as well. And I should note that this game has made an appearance on a couple of top 100 games lists, including that of IGN. I remember back in the day Animaniacs being part of an animated lineup that would play in the afternoons, and I didn't really watch this series that much as I preferred Tiny Toon Adventures back in the day, but I really liked the Pinky and the Brain segments, which is what this game centers around. In this game, the Brain once again has another plan to conquer the world by deciding to steal the script of the new Warner Brothers film while it was under development. The CEO of Warner Brothers tasks the Warner siblings for their assistance in retrieving all 24 pages of the script and foil the Brain's plan, which, depending on how many script pages you collect, determines the ending. Something a bit more unique about this style of platformer is that the characters have no life bar, lives, or special abilities. The game just simply ends when all of the characters are captured or defeated. Again, in my personal experience, this is not a game I've played back in the day, so I am playing this as an adult, and as an adult, I definitely appreciate how close they got to the art style of the cartoons, and the graphics of this game are spectacular in that regard. However, the gameplay was not something that appealed to me, especially as an adult. Maybe I had to play this as a kid. When looking at GamePro's review of this game, they noticed that the game had overly simplistic and frustrating gameplay. However, they also praised the graphics and colorful backgrounds and sprites as references to the TV show. My experience with this game, I would give it about a 5 or a 6 out of 10, and looking at other reviews of this game, I've seen it ranked as low as 3 out of 10, but averaging around 6 out of 10. I will note that the Genesis and Game Boy version is different from this game, so if you pick it up for another console, it's not going to be exactly the same as this. There were a number of games released between 1994 and 1995 based on Batman the Animated Series. The games that were made for the Sega Genesis, Game Gear, and Sega CD were all published by Sega, while the Super Nintendo version was published by Konami. The game itself very closely follows the art style of the animated series, and it really made me nostalgic for the days when I used to watch this on television. In this game, despite the title, you only take control of Batman, where you have to work your way through each stage, where you battle against one of the famous Batman villains at the end. Each level requires you to equip certain gadgets to be able to make it through, such as bombs or X-ray lenses. If you fail to equip the right gadgets, you can return to the Batcave in order to re-equip the right gadget and restart the stage, with all of your lives up to that point included. The game uses a password system in order to continue where you left off, and thankfully this also will restore the number of lives you had, instead of starting you out with a default number of lives, like in some other games. However, I will note, if you're playing on hard difficulty, the passwords will do nothing for you, because passwords can't be used on the hard difficulty. This game received the highest critical acclaim of all of the games based on Batman the Animated Series of the time. But that doesn't mean this game is without its flaws. Many game publications of the time were very critical of the fact that Robin only appears in cutscenes in the game, and at least one review was critical of the game by saying the character moved too slowly, making it difficult to pull off quick jumps or attacks, as well as the game's widely varying difficulty in different levels, making the game either way too easy or frustratingly hard right next to each other. Among the things that this game did well, reviewers noted that the atmosphere was set very well with the eerie music and the graphical style, which mostly held up, although they were critical of a few sections of the game. Overall, I wouldn't rank this as one of the best games on the platform, but I did enjoy it specifically because I was a fan of the TV show this is based off of. And I didn't find this to be badly designed or unfair in any way, except for the fact that the difficulty does flip-flop back and forth on you pretty easily. Overall, I'd give the game about a 7 out of 10, and I will note that IGN also ranked this game in its top 100 SNES games of all time. While I don't know if I agree with that assessment, it definitely is one that I would pick up if you're a fan of this series. Tiny Toon Adventures, Buster Busts Loose was released for the Super Nintendo in February of 1993. This game puts you in control of Buster Bunny as he works his way through 6 levels, each level with a varying objective. And there's really not much more for me to say about this game. I do remember renting this back in the day, but it wasn't the most common rental I would have. Mainly it would be when I had to settle for this game because the other game I really wanted was already checked out. And I think the main draw for me to this game was the fact that it was based on the TV series that I used to watch as a kid. I was kind of surprised to see that the reviews of this game are around 9 to 9.5 out of 10. With again, this game in particular being mentioned on some top 100 Super Nintendo games lists. While I do feel this is a very capable platformer, I really feel like it's more of the average variety. So not everybody may enjoy this platformer, but it is very well put together and could be a worthy addition to your collection. Prince of Persia was initially released as kind of a killer app for the Apple II in 1989. The game for that system was a technical marvel as it used rotoscope animation to produce some of the most realistic in-game animations up until that point. As the Apple II was kind of on its way out, this game was eventually ported to several different other home computers and game consoles in the early 1990s, with Konami publishing the version for the Super Nintendo. This version gives the game a huge graphical overhaul when compared to the Apple II version, but otherwise the gameplay is pretty well left intact. I know I may catch some heat for saying this, but I feel like this game is very overrated today. This is a game I believe is very much of its time, with I think the biggest draw being the fact that the in-game character animations were the most realistic seen up until that point. Nowadays, while this can provide an entertaining experience for some, I personally find it a bit tedious and boring and kind of a grind to try to get through this game nowadays. But this is coming from a point of somebody who never played it back in the day and only started playing it when I had to play multiple ports to multiple systems for these console videos. I am a much bigger fan of the later Prince of Persia games, so thankfully this series kept going, but if you want to see where this game got its start, you can check out this version on the Super Nintendo, and it should provide you with a faithful recreation of the original game. And there you have it. That is a look at the platform games released for the Super Nintendo by Nintendo themselves, Capcom, and Konami. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of the games that I showcased in today's video, and stay tuned for the next part. As you can see here, there are many more platformers to cover. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.